This is just a short little piece here where I'm drawing from imagination. And I always get the thing, how do you do this? How do you take and draw from imagination? Well, it really comes down to starting with the idea of the gesture, of course. That's always the thing that I start with in the beginning. And I'm drawing with it, by the way, is a sanguine polychromal pencil, the pencil that I usually draw with a lot. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to feel the flow of how the figure goes. Now, in doing this, I take and I'm experiencing the gesture myself. I'm thinking about what's going on, how it's going, and how do you get to the point of being able to do this? Well, it really comes down to where it all starts, and this is I bring this up all the time, but nobody seems to follow through very much. Everything I do pretty much comes from taking and composing composition. And it's really a question of what you're doing is you're experiencing the lines and you're drawing lines that are going to communicate the gesture. So you're composing it. Okay. Now, how do you get to that? Well, you get there by analyzing old masters. Not just the drawings. Now, I'm talking about analyzing the paintings and taking and trying to see how things go. So when you're composing something, what you're doing is you're leading the eye from one point to the next to the next. Well, that's how this gesture comes apart. And then the idea of even the constructing as I come through, thinking of cylinder forms and box forms, well, those are all elements that are used to take and analyze an action, a gesture. And so in analyzing a composition, how one form fits into another. And for instance, the very famous use of the box forms by Cambiaso. Well, those were developed as a way of taking and defining forms in space. One form relates to another in space. We find that also, of course, it had a lot to do with perspective, with the way Albert Dürer and Piero della Francesca and all the others, because in perspective you have to have points. But it's a tool. So the tools themselves are developed from analyzing and being able to construct the figure. So as I go through this, now I'm just building up slowly, and you can see I've already got a strong sense of the three-dimension. Well, from here, then the next step is you're talking about structure. So if, say, starting out with the structure of the head, coming through, I'm thinking where the corners of the eye sockets are. I take into consideration proportions. Well, in talking about proportions, I take and primarily go by looking. In other words, I can see that the head is going to go into the torso roughly 4 times. And if it's too small or too large, I'll change it. Now, then you start to adding anatomy to the simple volumes. So I'm constantly building the form up. So I'm doing this, I'm thinking of the sternum, bottom of the rib cage. But this is all meant to, first of all, of course it's anatomy. It helps to make the thing seem more realistic. But it's also, these are tools, these are landmarks that help us to take and show the gesture more clearly. So as we come through, and the idea of the compression, squash and stretch. In the animation industry, of course, we use the term line of action. But there's a confusion with that. Because the line of action is not the gesture. The line of action is it's a compositional statement saying what the primary line or direction of that figure is. It's not a gesture. The gesture is how the parts take and relate and what's the actual movements of the body. That's the gesture, not the two-dimensional shape of how something goes. And so there's a lot of confusion with that. And so we have to keep in mind that a lot of the terms that are used were developed early on in animation. And the artists that took and made the terms were generally trained more in terms of even analysis of the fine arts and illustration. So now you can see I've got this thing pretty much going. Now from here, I start to consider a little bit more carefully. I'm coming in now and I'm thinking that the form is turning. I'm going over the surface of the form. And again, this will go back to analyzing the volumes. Here you can take a look at the drawings of, say, a Michelangelo, Albert Dürer, or Da Vinci. You see that the going across the surface of the form becomes a means of describing the form. It takes and clarifies where things are in space. So as we're dealing with this, then, we come through and we build. So now you can see each step that I go through here, I'm taking and carrying it a little bit farther. And so we have the components. We have first, as you're analyzing, you have to take and capture the gesture. Talking about, now if I was analyzing, let's say, a painting, and this was a drawing, a part figure in a painting, I would be thinking about how these lines worked with something else, how they take and build, and say how one figure takes and goes into and relates to another figure as we start going back in. And you can see right away that the continuity continue. You extend every line to see how they work in relationship to each other. So here I used the idea of the box because I was taking and going through and moving up into the head. So this is the beginning. Now, so as we take and we develop, you study by analyzing compositions. You see how one figure relates to another. Well, that's the way you actually do the drawing. So that when I'm taking and analyzing, let's say that there's another figure going over in this direction. Well, I would be taking and seeing how do these lines relate to what I've got going here. And if this figure now is taking and, say, turning, well, I would be drawing the box to take and analyze which way it's turning. And then I would take and, so we're doing the same thing. We're always analyzing the turning, how the head turns, coming through. And this is the way you take and you work from imagination. You first have to have the composition, the action, the overall sense of what you're doing before you can start getting involved in any kind of rendering of the form. So it's the total, it's the composition that takes and comes into play. So as you're constantly building these things, so I noticed, obviously, I'm not copying. And actually, when you're taking and studying and analyzing paintings and drawings, you're not copying, you're studying, you're analyzing how the forms take and relate to each other. And then as you look at it, and I suggest to students, don't just copy drawings, look at the paintings. It's the paintings that are resolved. That's what you want to go. That's the end you want to understand, the clarified final sense of the composition. But the process of doing the drawing is the analysis. And as you analyze it, for instance, you could come in and I would be thinking, once I've got this, I can start to look and say, well, okay, how is it working with the tone? Do we have a core coming through? How do we take and build these volumes? How do we start to take and analyze? And I in my regular online classes and my regular classes I take, and these are elements that we deal with. We take and focus on how you take and use the tone to take and push the gesture to clarify the whole process that you're going through. So you build, and even to take and think of the atmosphere. In other words, if I was taking and dealing with atmosphere, I would be coming through and feeling the way the tone comes through and wraps around over. Well, this is a byproduct of analysis, of understanding the Italians, particularly in the Baroque ideas of atmosphere, as they refer to it as the smoke, how you pull the forms wrapping around. So all of this, everything I do is based on the study of composition. And of course, I have 2 classes going on composition so that you can join. But this is the beginning. First, the mechanics are tools that help you to not only create something, they're tools that help you to analyze and to learn from the old masters.